but
I mean, you said this time's at 7, right?
yeah.
Let me just make sure it's working.
Just 2 viewers. Is that you? 3?
Concurrent viewers. It's only me.
What?
It's only me watching. Alright, so yeah, there's a live chat here. So this is probably what you want to have like.
Help me with this.
Oh, what's the delay? That's a long delay. Okay. Alright, so this. So there's a delay of about 10 seconds. Yeah. Just make sure you're looking at this screen for reference of making sure everyone can see what you're doing.
Get rid of that glare right there.
So there's a delay of about 10 seconds.
So that hello? What?
No, that. I'll be.
You can help me at 7 o'clock. Just happy with the food. You need dinner yet. So if someone were to come on right now, they could hear all this?
Pretty much.
How do I see who's on? Will it pop up here?
You can't really use.
So when does it start recording?
Oh.
Or it'll just...
If you want to start recording, just click here.
But when I start live streaming, it'll just automatically start recording?
Yeah, I'll already keep it, and once you end the live stream, it'll stay.
Alright, I'll show you how to do that. It's so much easier to just go back to school.
There's a 10-second delay on the live stream.
I'm gonna watch my lecture.
It's an econ lecture.
What?
That was Jacob, I think.
Is that him?
Yeah.
Maybe I should change my shirt. I don't know. Daddy's supposed to get food.
Alright, I'm trying to get in this server, but it's full.
Oh, is it full? My bad. One second. Almost finished with this thing that I'm making. It's pretty cool. Trust me. You're gonna love it.
Wait, okay, Jacob. On the live stream, are you able to hear like you and me?
I can. Or no, I can.
Oh, not on the stream?
Or I don't think so. I need to wait for the delay.
Whatever.
I don't know if this design works, but if it works, I'll be so happy. Like, if you're satisfied with that, I'll be so happy.
Oh, no.
Pretty happy with this design. I think it just needs a bit of polishing, and it just needs a bit more detail. But I think you'll be happy with it too. I think you're gonna really enjoy this. I actually made 2 more things. What?
Creative plots on Minecraft.
What?
Have you ever played on like creative plots on Minecraft servers? It's basically like the same thing, just like you get like some land and like you're putting on that.
Oh, that thing. Oh, I don't know. So, for the most part,
Chico, how about this blue light here?
now I just need you to like.
I don't. Oh.
What? Wait, look at this. Look at this.
Oh.
Honestly, I just want to find a way to like make it like. I just want to find a way to like add more detail to this part.
the shade.
That doesn't look too bad.
Just clap for the shade.
How does that?
Where'd you go? What else did you get there?
So you do not know how stress that is. Like, I was just trying to figure
Oh, I didn't get a chance.
right now is I can't.
quiet.
Oh, it's nice. You didn't use the tripod? Oh,
I'm going to use the laptop.
okay.
There might be students on right now.
Oh.
Hello, students. Sorry, I'm going to have to resort to using YouTube. We're trying to use Canvas, but as you can imagine, every teacher is using Canvas, so there's been quite a bit of technical difficulty. So I'm going to have to use YouTube Live, and hopefully this will work out. All right, so I've made some changes to how I'm going to grade. Obviously, I can't do the traditional exam and problem set as stated in the syllabus. So right now I'm going to use a combination of more problem sets, and I'm going to attempt to use quizzes on Canvas. So please continue to check Canvas regularly for updates. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to talk briefly about Chapter 6. I'm not going to lecture for a whole hour and a half. So I'm just going to get to the main points, and you're going to have to read in addition to whatever I post on YouTube. And if you have questions, there's a live chat. You can also respond to each other. And if you have questions after the live stream, you can always email me, and I'll do my best to get back to you. All right, so and one more note, if you have not submitted the first problem set, I will still accept it. I'll probably take a point off for it being late, but I do want you to be able to turn in your work. All right, so Chapter 6 is all about GDP. Now, just a brief history. Back in October 1929, the stock market crashed, and it set off what is known as the Great Depression. So the Great Depression lasted from October 1929 up until World War II, which was in 1942, at least from the standpoint of the United States. During that time, throughout the 1930s, the government knew that the economy was depressed, but they had no way of knowing how bad things were. So this American economist Simon Kuznets, back in 1934, came up with this measurement for GDP. All right, so I'll go over each of the components. Oops. Bear with me. Right, so Simon Kuznets had no way of knowing how bad the economy had done it. Obviously, people were out of work. There was quite a bit of quite a bit of lost businesses closing around that time. In addition to bank closures, a lot of the real estate market began collapsing. So to somehow measure the income of a country, he came up with this formula of GDP. So GDP, and oftentimes it's denoted with the letter Y for income. And this is basically the income of a country. Now, GDP measures two things simultaneously. It measures both income and it measures expenditures. Now, imagine you lived in a village and you go to the village market and you buy yourself a fish and you pay $5 for your fish. Well, the fish cost $5 and that was your expenditure because that's what you spent to obtain the fish. But for the fisherman, he received $5 in income. So if we were to measure the GDP of this little village, then the $5 is both income for the fisherman and my expenditure because that's what I spent. So when we measure GDP, we're measuring both the spending and the income within the country. So you could think of it as one person's spending is another person's income. Now, obviously, we don't live in a small village. Nowadays, for instance, if you go to the mall and you buy yourself a pair of shoes, and let's say you pay $50 for this pair of shoes, the $50 obviously doesn't go to one person, but it pays for the salaries of various people. So part of the $50 paid for the salary of the store worker, part of it paid for the person who shipped the shoes from the manufacturer to the store. Part of it paid the designer who designed the shoes. Part of it went to the manufacturer, and so on and so forth. Right, so going over each component, we think of who buys stuff within a country. C stands for consumption. And oftentimes we could think of this as total household spending. And in the United States, this actually makes up the largest component of our GDP. And if you have your slides, you can see that it includes durable goods. Durable goods tend to be things that last for several years, like cars and furniture. Non-durable goods are things that typically are consumed and they don't last as long, maybe 1 to 3 years. And then services. Services is another sector of consumption, and that includes things like going to the hospital, the dry cleaners, car wash, the mechanic, dog groomer, what have you. Those are all services. Going to Starbucks or going to Denny's is considered services because they're preparing meals and they're serving you. Right. So one thing to note, GDP is measured yearly and it's also measured quarterly. So quarterly, and I'm going to squeeze that over here. Quarterly, that's every 3 months. So there's a quarterly measurement and then there's also an annual measurement of GDP. And what they do is they track how much income is generated from 1 quarter, 3 months to the next. Right. So another thing to note, and going a little bit out of order, what GDP measures also is what's called final goods. So the difference between final goods and intermittent goods, basically final goods is something like tires. If you were to go to Pep Boys and buy a set of tires, then the tires are considered a final good. If the tires are sold to Toyota and Nissan and then they're put on the car, then sold, the tires are then considered an intermediate good. Right, so in that example, the car would be the final good. So we don't count the car and the tires together, then we would be double counting. So the final good would be the car. Right, going over the next component, we have I, and I'm going to squeeze it up here. We call this investment. Investment spending. Now, when we use the term investment in economics, I'm not talking about buying stocks and bonds. Investment in this case means capital purchases, or sometimes we could think of this as firm spending. Firm spending. Now, if you can imagine, what are the things firms and businesses spend on to run their business? Well, capital can include things like machinery, cash registers, equipment, tools, technology, computers. If it's a bakery, it could include their ovens and sinks, and so anything that a business needs to run and conduct business, that's considered for or investment spending. Right, and then this last category, not last, excuse me, this next one is G for government spending. And government spending includes a number of things. So obviously pays for things like roads and bridges and schools and hospitals, but it also includes the salaries of government workers. So all the firefighters, teachers, judges, and all our politicians. This is all included under government spending, and military also included under government spending. So it's a large portion of GDP. What it doesn't include are things like Social Security. So that's a separate item. Right, and then this last bit right here, I'm going to put it off to the side. This is what's called net exports. And one way to think of this is X minus M, which is exports. I'm going to put in small print, exports minus imports. Right, so one thing to note with net exports, and I'm going to put it down here, a trade surplus. Trade surplus is when we have a condition where NX is positive. Well, let me do it this way. NX is greater than 0 or it's positive. In other words, exports are greater than imports, right? And if this is a case where NX is positive and X is greater than M, then we call this a trade surplus. A trade deficit is a condition where we have NX is negative or less than 0. In other words, X is less than M. Oh, sorry, let me fix that. And if by some miracle that we say trade balance, this is a rare condition where Nx is exactly equal to 0, or in other words, we export exactly what we import, and that almost never happens. At least I haven't seen it. Most countries are either in a trade surplus or a trade deficit. And usually I ask this question in class, where do you think the United States stands? And if you answered trade deficit, then you are absolutely correct. The United States tends to export less than they import. In other words, we import a greater deal than we export. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. There are pros and cons to either a trade surplus or trade deficit, and we'll get to that when we talk about trade more in depth. All right, so these are the basic components of GDP. So you imagine within a country, all the spending that goes on, whether it's through the households or the firms or governments or what we export out to other countries, all of this gets measured, and each country keeps a record of its spending. And this is sort of a proxy for how much income a country makes. Now, one of the reasons we want to know how much income a country makes is because this is sort of the measurement for whether people are able to have income, and we need income to pay for things like food and shelter, transportation, and clothing and furniture, and to have a decent standard of living. So that's the idea behind measuring GDP. Do we have income? Does this country growing in income? So let's look, and I've included some links. Have you noticed that I'm using my phone? I don't have a PowerPoint, but if you're following the following the PowerPoint slides, I've put some links up so we could look at real life data, and the website I use is from the World Bank. So if you're able, you can pull it up, and if not, you can always do it at the end of live streaming. So right, so if you were able to open the link and look at the World Bank, let's look at some real life countries. So for instance, I like to take a look at Canada, and let me say that this is GDP. And nominal values, and this is 2018. Right, so I want to look up Canada. Right, so I have Canada. I also want to look up data on China. And I'm going to look up Luxembourg. Right. And I'll also look up US, but I'll get to the United States in just a bit. Right, so I took this from the World Bank, and I'm going to write this out. So if you're looking at the World Bank website, Their data is, it's in US dollars, and it is measured in the millions. So if you look where the decimal point is, that's in terms of millions. So I'm going to write the whole number out. So Canada, their GDP for 2018 comes out to 1,313,700,000. I like to write the entire number out so you kind of get a feel for what this actually looks like. And that is quite a bit of money. Right, so if you scroll down a bit, we'll take a look at China. China's GDP for 2018 comes out to 13 trillion, 608 billion, 151 million, 860,000, and some zeros. And I'm going to put up Luxembourg. If you've never heard of this country, Luxembourg, it's a tiny landlocked country in Western Europe. Their GDP is that 70 billion, 885 million. 330,000. Right, so looking at the GDP from these three countries, and this is all the income from the countries. So you can imagine every household, every business, the government, all of their spending amounts to this right here. And the question I like to ask is, out of these three, which country do you think is the richest? Now, some may simply look at the numbers and say, well, China has $13 trillion, therefore they are the richest country. But if you've ever traveled to China or Canada or Luxembourg, you might think otherwise, right? So usually someone in class will say, well, it really depends on the population, right? So if you can imagine Canada, I forget their population, but it's in the hundreds of millions of people, whereas China, they think they have like roughly 1.4 billion residents in China, right? So just looking at it could be kind of misleading, and you would look at Luxembourg and say, oh, well, they only have $70 billion compared to China or Canada. They're not rich at all. I don't know if you can see, there's a little bit of a glare. Sorry, I don't know how to remove that. So the numbers can be misleading, right? So we look at another measurement. So imagine if we were to take this income and divide it equally amongst its citizens. And before I get to that, let me put up the United States just for comparison. So the United States GDP in 2018 came out to 20 trillion, 544 billion, 343,460,000, right? Right, so looking at these, we could say, well, clearly the United States is probably the richest country in the world. But let's look at another measurement, right? Again, population matters because even though these countries have this money, it depends on how many people live in the country. So we're going to look at another measurement called GDP per capita. And I'm going to just abbreviate it. GDP per capita. And this is for 2018 again. Right, so the way you find GDP per capita is you take the GDP and you divide it by the entire adult population. And adult population means 16 and over. I know in the United States, 18 is considered an adult, but for the purposes of measuring GDP per capita, they use 16 and over. So if you take every adult 16 and over, and well, you take the GDP divided by the population, then we get GDP per capita. So let's look at what it is per country. So in Canada, we could say that the average adult makes $46,233 in a year, right? So that's taking this 1.7 trillion, dividing it by the population, adult population. Each adult would make 46,233. What is China? Now you can imagine 13,680 billion dollars divided by the population in China. Their GDP per capita comes out to 770, excuse me. Luxembourg, though they have probably the smallest GDP compared to these other three countries, because they are a tiny country with a smaller population divided equally, each adult would make $116,630. Right, and if we were to look at the United States, and you imagine $20 trillion, that is a lot of money. If we were to divide that equally amongst all the adults in the United States, then each person over the age of 16 would make $62,794, right? And I like to do this in my class. I ask who is over the age of 16. Usually everyone puts up their hand in class because we're all over the age of 16. But how many of us are actually making $62,794 a year? If you can imagine a family, the mother and father, and I don't know if you have siblings over the age of 16, can you imagine each person making $62,000? I have a 17-year-old son. He makes nothing close to that. Actually, he doesn't make any money at all. So anyways, this is GDP per capita. Now, if we were to just look at this, it can be misleading, right? So we look at what it is per capita, and it gives us a little bit of a bigger picture as to what the average person in these countries make, right? So, but obviously, cost of living is different in these various countries, but it gives us a broad idea. So we could say, well, it looks like Canada and the United States, they're fairly similar in terms of standard of living. China's going to catch up. And Luxembourg, we can assume that they have a fairly high standard of living. So anyways, these are some of the measurements that we use, right? And it's important to understand what it is we're looking at, because this is really what guides policies. All right, one other thing I want to touch on. Right, so in the United States, and this is the United States GDP, and this is 2018, and I'm going to put up 1960. So 1960, the GDP was 543 Let's see, do I have enough? Okay. So back in 1960, the GDP, I'm going to get rid of that glare. The GDP in the United States was $543,300,000,000 dollars, and this was in 1960. In 2018, our GDP is now 20.5 trillion. Now, what most countries want to know, and I know this is a fairly large gap between years, right? So this is roughly, was it 60 years ago? But what most countries want to know is, are we growing? Are we being more productive, right? And the idea is we want to be more productive because we want people to have a higher standard of living. So if we're growing in income, then perhaps we are growing in standard of living, or at least that is the hope, right? So how do we compare the 1960s to 2018? Now, and we asked the question, well, why are the numbers different? How did we get from 543 billion to 20 trillion dollars? Now, I'll give you one more formula, and I want you to think about why these numbers are different. So, revenue is equal to price times quantity. And I'm going to have to abbreviate it. That's quantity in the corner. So revenue is just a fancy word for income. And if you want to know, like for instance, if you own a business and you want to know how much revenue is coming in, so if I, for instance, sell hot dogs, and I want to know how much revenue is coming in when I sell these hot dogs, and let's say I sell the hot dogs for $1, and I sell 100 hot dogs, then my revenue is 1 times 100, or I've received $100 in revenue, right? So we can think of GDP also as revenue, right? Because remember, this is all the household spending, firm spending, government spending, and they buy things, right? They pay a certain price, and we have to multiply how many is sold, right? So now, when we go from 1960 to 2018, how did we get this large jump in numbers? Is it because we're actually buying more stuff, or because prices have changed? Now, you might say both have changed, right? So think about how much prices, or how much things cost in the 1960s. So for instance, what did a hamburger cost in the 1960s? Probably cost, I don't know, 50 cents or 75 cents. And if you compare it, what does a burger cost today, or in 2018? A burger might cost anywhere from $4, $5, $6. And think of maybe a house. How much did a house cost in 1960, right? And compare what did a house cost in 2018, right? So prices were different from 1960 to 2018. So question is, did we really grow, or is this change in GDP because of changes in price? Now, if we want to make a real comparison, what we can do is we can use constant prices. If we want to know how much quantities have changed, then we have to keep prices constant, or we're going to keep it fixed. right? When we fix prices, then we can control for inflation, right? So these are nominal values. Nominal means that they're measured in current prices. So think of the cost of things in the 1960s times the quantity, right? Then it gives us this fairly small number, right? And then the prices of things in 2018 times the quantity, obviously we're going to get a larger number. So to combat that, we have to use what's called real GDP. Real GDP. And this means that it's been adjusted for inflation. Right, so if you go to the next PowerPoint slide, we have a problem, practice problem, and to solve that practice problem, there's a number of formulas on the previous slide, and let me put that up so you can see it. So two of them that you'll need. Actually, there's there's one missing. You'll need to know the. Let me write this here. Sorry. GDP growth rate. So the GDP growth rate, and the easy way to remember it is anytime you need a growth rate formula, the formula I like to memorize is new minus old divided by old. So in this case, I'm going to use the new GDP minus the old GDP. Sorry, that says old. Divided by, again, the old GDP, and then this is going to be times 100. All right, so let me make a little space there. Right, so this is a typical growth rate formula to find the growth rate of GDP, and this is what we actually measure whenever you watch the news and they talk about GDP growth rate. And when you multiply by 100, it's going to give you a percent, and it'll tell us whether GDP is growing or shrinking. Now, as I mentioned, GDP is measured every 3 months, quarterly. If we get 2 quarters, and let me put that up here. So 2 quarters. Two quarters of negative GDP growth, then we call this a recession. Right, hopefully you can see that. If you've been following the news, there's been lots of talks about the economy going into recession, and many economists are predicting that. It's hard to say, considering the amount of stimulus that's being pumped into the economy at this moment. We'll just have to wait and see. For now, we know with all the massive layoffs and businesses closing, it's almost certain to create a negative GDP growth, and certainly if it lasts for more than 2 quarters or 6 months. So 2 quarters, this is 6 months. Then we can officially announce that the country is in a recession. But many economists right now are predicting that we certainly are going to be in a recession. Now, how deep is this recession and how long will it last? That's hard to say. Right, so again, it's just going to be another wait and see. And who knows, we may have quite a bit more stimulus going on, especially with all the other countries It's hard to say how this pandemic will pan out. Hopefully, we'll have a treatment or some sort of medication soon. All right, so going back to this, we'll need this to measure the GDP growth rate. The other formula you will need is to measure the inflation rate. So inflation, and there's two ways to measure inflation, and tonight we'll learn one method, and it's using the GDP deflator. So that, and I'm gonna abbreviate it deflator. So DEF is deflator, and again I'm gonna say the new deflator minus the old deflator. Divided by the old, and then this is times 100, will give us the inflation rate. Sorry, let me tilt that so you can see. So we'll need these two formulas. The other one you'll need is on that slide, and I'm going to squeeze it here in the corner. So the GDP deflator is equal to the nominal divided by real, and then this is times 100. We're going to squeeze that up here. And that's basically all the formulas you're going to need to solve the, the problem set on the next page. Right, so going to the next page, and I have it here on my phone. Hopefully you're following along. I'll just do, well, I guess I'll do the first three, and then when you get your problem set, which I'm currently writing, and I'll have it posted by tomorrow, you should be able to do these fairly quickly. So it's just basic algebra. And again, if you're lost, you can always email me, and I'll do my best to get back to you. And I apologize, I've been, last week's been very hectic. I've also been sick, as you can hear. So anyways, bear with me. Okay, so looking at the practice problem, and let's solve, we want the nominal GDP for 2015. And it's just a matter of solving for the unknown. So I'm given the GDP deflator and the real GDP, so I can just simply plug it into that formula that I had earlier. So my nominal, that's going to be, I'm going to use N, get the number. And this is in billion US dollars. So this is 1,314 billion. This is Australia's GDP, and this is this would be times 100. And I know that my GDP deflator is given right there. All right, so this is basic algebra. We can simply solve for n. So my n, and I'll write this out. All right, and then my n should be, and I'll just go ahead and round it off. So this is 1,352 billion, right? And this is my nominal GDP for 2015. To find real, and let's do 2016. So I want real GDP 2016. Again, I could just solve for my unknown. Let me write it out. I'll just use n again for my unknown, times 100. And this is equal to 89.5. Right. So this is what I'm solving for. I need to solve for n. So to solve for n, I need to get this 100 on the other side. Right, and then to get n, I need to get n out of the denominator. I can just cross multiply, so I'll do right, so oops. Okay, there we go. So my n is right. So hopefully I did that correctly. So it's 1,352,000,000,000. So once you've gotten these numbers, then we can solve the question. So, and I'll just do, well, I'll do number 2. So number 2, what is the GDP growth rate from 2015 to 16? So when we're looking for GDP growth rate, you want to use the real values. So if you're looking at the chart, look at real GDP, and I'm going to put that up here. So this is number 2 on your problem set. Right, so 2015 to 16. So I'm gonna use this value. So 1352, and if I've made a mistake, let me know and I'll correct myself. Okay, 13. Right, so using my real values, so I've gotten this from the far right column, and this is my new GDP minus the old divided by old times 100, and this should give me my GDP growth rate. And it should come out to 2.89 if I've done this correctly, which I think I have. And that is our GDP growth rate for Australia between 2015 and 16. Right, to get the inflation rate, first of all, I need the GDP deflator. So why don't we solve for the GDP deflator for 2017, then we can find our inflation rate. So GDP deflator for, and this is 2017, this is going to, it's simple to find a GDP deflator because it's simply nominal divided by real which is 1383, and then times 100. Right, so this comes out to 95.8. And it's fine to just go one decimal. If you want to go two, that's fine as well. But we could leave it like that. Right, so to answer number three on the problem set, I ask, what is the inflation rate from 2017 to 18? All right, so this is my 2017 value. So I'm looking for inflation. So the inflation rate, and I'm going to use Gdp Deflator. Right, so that's going to be 100 minus 95.8 divided by 95.8 times 100. Right, so our inflation rate comes out to 4.38%. Or we could say that the the Australian dollar devalued at a rate of 4.38%. So one way to think of that. Okay, so and then the last question, if the population in Australia is roughly 25.2 million people, what is the GDP per capita in 2018? Well, you simply take the real GDP, and I'm not going to put that up on the board because you can, it's basic algebra, and divided by the population. All right, so hopefully that is enough for you to be able to do the problem sets. And again, if you have questions, let me know or email me and I'll do my best to get back to you all. All right, so the last slide, we have nominal and real interest rates. So anytime you see the word real, this means it's been adjusted for inflation, right? So there are real GDP, real wages, real interest rates, and let's look at real interest rates really quickly because this is an important one, especially when you have accounts like a checking account or not checking account, a savings account. Your real interest rate is what you're really earning if you were to put your money in some sort of an account. So real interest is going to be equal to your nominal interest minus inflation. Now, I don't know what the current inflation rate is, but let's go back from a year ago. The inflation rate, at least last year, was roughly around 3%. And I like to ask my class, what is the interest rate that you typically earn on a savings account? Now, if any of you own a savings account, you know that the interest rate is actually very, very low. Oftentimes it's this is basically what you would earn on a typical savings account. It's not even 1%, it's 0.01 or 1/100th of a percent of a dollar is what you earn in interest. Now, the question is, what are we really earning if we were to put our money into a savings account? that earns 0.01%. Well, we got to know what the inflation rate, and at least last year, I believe the inflation rate, let's just say it was around 2%, for example. The question is, what is our real interest rate then in this case? And you want to punch it in your calculator, you can. It comes out to, this comes out to negative 1.99%. Right. So are you earning anything on your savings account, or are you actually losing money? And the answer is you're actually losing money. If you were to put your money in a savings account that earns 0.01%. Why? Because the effects of inflation. Money devalues over time. And if the inflation rate is greater than what you're earning on your account, then you're definitely losing money, right? Or what you're losing is purchasing power, right? So for future use, when you're looking at places to put your money or your savings, you want to make sure that whatever the account is paying, is greater than the current inflation rate, right? So this is your real interest. Okay, so that's it for chapter 6. I'm going to move on to chapter 7. I won't spend a great deal of time. I'm starting to lose my my voice. And chapter 7 is more reading anyway. So please do read the chapters. As I mentioned, I'm going to try and put some quizzes up on Canvas, so please check Canvas. And it should all be due by next Sunday, before the next class. All right, so I'm just going to talk really briefly on chapter 7. I've also embedded some videos, so please watch the videos. But really, economic growth, it's really an extension of chapter 6. So chapter 6 is measuring income. Chapter 7 is income growing, right? And why do we want income to grow? Well, it's kind of obvious. We want standard of living to improve. At least that's the hope. And why we have governments, right, to improve our standard of living. And in many ways, we have come a long way. The standard of living has improved from the 1900s. Healthcare has improved, education's improved, even the size of a house. So if you look at the size of a typical house from the 1960s and 70s compared to today, the average house has gotten bigger. People own more cars. They're eating out more often. So economic growth is important to take note of. Right, so I won't go over the history. You can look at the video. I will go over the production function. So that says production function, and excuse my writing. We're looking at this from a business standpoint, right? So imagine you are a restaurant owner, right? And this could be any business, right? And on this axis, we have what's called inputs. Inputs are anything you need to run your business, and typical things that we need in a business is capital, and we need labor. And oftentimes we'll see this denoted with K and L. So oftentimes this is how we see capital and labor. I don't know why they use K for capital, and well, L is obvious. Right, so your inputs into your business is your capital and labor, so that's things like machinery, your inventory, pots, pans, tools, cash registers, computers, etc., etc. Right, and then on this axis we have our output. And your output is whatever it is you're producing. So you need your inputs, your combination of capital and labor, and they create outputs. And our production function will look something along the lines like this. Now, the nice thing is we're not going to calculate anything. We just want to have an understanding of what this is. So this is our production function. And it's some function of combination of capital and labor. All right, so I'm going to use a simple example. Imagine you own a restaurant, and I think I used that example. Obviously, if we have zero capital and zero labor, we're going to have zero output. But let's say I add one chef, right? And then that one chef, obviously that one chef can and let's assume he has some equipment, that one chef can produce a number of meals, right? So this one chef can produce some amount of output, right? And let's say we add another chef. This second chef can also produce outputs, right? And combined, they're going to produce even more meals, right? Now they're at this level. If we add another chef, so now we have 3 chefs. Again, we're producing more output. And now we're producing this level. Right? If we continue to add another chef, we will still get some more output, but it's, as you can see, the amount of output that results from an additional unit of labor, or in this case, another chef, it starts to decline, and we've seen this before, right? So this is the amount of output from the first chef, the second, and the third, fourth, and we keep going and add another chef. We can see that our returns are diminishing, right? So again, when we have this curved production function, we see the law of diminishing returns. Right. And I'm going to go straight to the practice problem in chapter 7. There's just one formula you're going to need to know to solve it, and I wasn't able to squeeze it in here, so I'm going to have to give that formula to you. All right, so PV stands for present value, and FE is our future value. Oh goodness, you know what? Sorry, I have this reverse. right, hopefully I got that correct. Yeah, okay, so apologize. This is future value, and this is present value. The R is going to be our growth rate. And then this N is going to be number of periods. And oftentimes, number of periods is measured in years. All right, so that's probably the only formula you'll need to go through the problem set in Chapter 7. All right, so I'll go through a few of them. Let me pull it up. And let's look at, let's do South Korea. So part A says calculate the growth rate, and we're going to use real GDP from 2013 to 14. So South Korea, I'm going to put it down here, South Korea. And I want 2013 to 14. So again, I'm going to use my formula, new minus old divided by old. All right, so this is my growth rate formula for South Korea, and punching in those numbers. All right, I get 7.6% growth rate for South Korea, and seems about right. All right, and then part B, it says, using this growth rate, what will the GDP of the country be in 10 years? So, in other words, what is the future value of South Korea's GDP in 10 years? So, we're going to use this growth rate that we've calculated here. We're going to plug that into this formula and crunch the numbers. So I'm going to make a little space right here. Right. So I know my present value. I'm going to just use my most recent value, which is 2014. So that's going to be 1.41 trillion. And that's 1 plus my growth rate. And one thing to note that I want this in decimal form. So this is going to be 0.076. So I'm going to plug that in here. And my number of periods, that's going to be in 10 years. So this is what I'm basically solving. Remember your order of operations. We got to do what's in the parentheses first. So this is 1.076, and I'm going to plug that in. And then raise to the 10th, and then times 1.41. So I get 2.93, and I'm going to put this, and this is trillion US dollars. Right, so if we assume, in other words, one way to think of this is if South Korea maintains this growth rate of 7.6%, then in 10 years we can project that their GDP will grow to 2.9 trillion. Right. And that's it for tonight. I hope you've been able to take notes. I'm going to leave this video up so you can rewatch. And if anyone's missed the class tonight, hopefully they can catch up. So please reach out to some of your classmates in case they're not checking their emails. Also, I will accept late work, so please just do your best to keep up with the coursework. I've also been notified that if you want, you can, I believe they're extending the withdrawals. So instead of getting a W, it would be, if you were to drop now, you would get a EW, which is an excused withdrawal. I don't know how that affects your GPA, but you want to talk to your counselor if that's something you're considering. If not, I hope you're able to keep up with the coursework. Obviously, I'm going to make changes. So until then, I will see you next week.